Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Joining us via Skype from Warsaw is historian William Hastings Burke, whose fascinating book, 34, describes the daring exploits of Albert Goering, Field Marshall Herman Goering's little brother, who defied the Nazis to save Jews and others from the Holocaust. William, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
William, most people who've studied World War II know a bit about the dark history of Hermann Goering, Hitler's number 2 and commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, but very few people knew he had a little brother who was a fervent anti-Nazi, and apparently another Oskar Schindler. Start us off with a little context about Hermann and how he became the monster behind Hitler's final solution.
I think you can just list every title that Hermann had. First of all, he was the Reichsmarshal. Mm-hmm. He was the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany. If Hitler was to ever die, Hermann would have taken over Nazi Germany. He was also the man who initiated the final solution. His signature initiated the final solution. He was the one to introduce concentration camps to Germany early and after the takeover power in 1933, mainly for communists at the time. He was a World War I fighter ace, and the list goes on. He was ahead of the 5-year plan, and also, obviously, the head of the Luftwaffe, which was the German Air Force at the time.
Now, Hermann ended his days taking cyanide shortly before he was about to be hung after the famous post-war Nuremberg trials, and his little brother Albert almost met the same fate. How did Albert clear his name?
Albert, I think his name was actually not officially cleared. What Albert did, when he gave himself up to the Allies and began to tell his story, they, of course, didn't believe him. You know, he's the brother of Albert Goering, as I've just established. You know, he was the personification of the devil almost in American interrogators' minds. So what he did, he wrote up this list of the 34 most prominent people he saved. Now, on this list of famous people, there's Chancellor Kurt von Schuschnigg of Austria, there's directors, there's producers, and I guess what he wrote and why he chose these names was basically a map for his interrogators. So hopefully they would find these people on this list, contact them, and hopefully they would verify his story. That didn't really happen. So he was in custody just about over 18 months with the Americans. So they didn't really know what to do with him. They kind of, in the end, believed him that he did actually do all what he professed, but they wanted to keep him as a witness. But then after, I guess, Hermann committed suicide, and after the sentencing, they didn't need him anymore. So they extradited him to the Czechs, where he stood trial again there. And you could even say that his trial just kept going. Then even after he was released and exonerated by the Czechs in post-war Austria and Germany, because of his name, because of his brother, he could not live a normal life. He ended up living as a pauper, a pariah in his own country, even though he was this hero who stood out of the rest of his fellow citizens.
Well, we'll get to that. But first, how did you get involved with this story?
It was quite a... It's very crazy, yeah. I was first-year university student, and it was late nights. I'd just been cramming for exam, and I turned on the History Channel, as I always did. You know, I've always been interested in this particular history. And I found this documentary trying to tell me that Hermann Goering had a younger anti-Nazi brother. First, I didn't believe it, but then as the story went on, the layers of the story, I was just pulled. And I guess what really got me was the injustice of the story. I saw how he was treated directly after the war by the Allies and the Czechs. And then in post-war Germany and Austria, how he became this pariah. But also then his whole story, his whole legacy had been hidden by his brother's bulging shadow. And there was just this huge hole in history for me. And I was just dumbfounded by it.
And this put you on the road.
Yeah, not initially. I had to finish university first, but then after finishing university, when I had the time, it was just gnawing at me. It was, I was filled with this curiosity and also this, sense of injustice. And you got to remember that Albert's story is inspiring in itself. So I kind of thought I had friends going off on aid missions in the Pacific and Africa, and I thought that here's this guy. He saved so many people. The least I could do was salvage his legacy in some way. And so therefore I bought a round-the-world ticket. Didn't really have an idea what I'd write or even I'd write a book. I just wanted to try and find, I guess, the truth to it.
It turned into an amazing book, 34, which I just finished last night, which is an intermingling of your travel story as a young historian and Albert's life story as you unraveled it. Take us back to the beginning, because it's such a Cain and Abel story. Hermann was bullied in school and responded by growing up to become a fighter ace and commander of the famous World War I Red Baron Squadron. But Albert was shy and retiring. Give us a little more insight into the contrast of their personalities.
They grew up in castles. They grew up in one in Bavaria and in Burg Markendorf in Austria, and the other one was Burg Feldenstein. The beneficiaries of their godfather, Hermann von Eckenstein. And the rumor is that Albert was actually the son of Hermann von Eckenstein.
If you look at their pictures, he looks completely different from his brother physically.
Yes. I actually just came across a picture of the whole family, and yes, they look completely different. The sisters and also Hermann look quite similar, but you have Albert. You can tell that they have a common mother. They have similar kind of facial sort of structures. But they were totally different. Hermann was, the buccaneer, the boy marching off to folk battles of the Boer War, and he was the one trying to climb mountains and, the outdoors sort of type. He was the one who went to military school as a cadet and became a fighter ace later on. Whereas Albert was more a reserved type, as you say. He preferred the indoors and books and arts and the culture, and he could play just about every musical instrument there was. And it was quite interesting looking at him then, because he was definitely in the shadow of his brother, and his brother was the one that was, I guess, celebrated by his godfather, even though Albert had this, uncanny resemblance to him. Hermann was the star in the family's eye, even though he was a bit of a lout, I'd say.
So after Hitler came to power and Hermann Goering rose to prominence, Albert tried to escape the growing madness in Germany by becoming an Austrian citizen. That didn't do him much good, did it?
No. Before 1933, Albert actually moved to Vienna as a sales representative for Junkers. But it was only until after 1933 that he began the process of taking out Austrian citizenship. And also you should remember that he hadn't spoken to his brother for nearly a decade after the Beerhole Putsch. Albert had already foreseen it. He had shared at the university with Himmler, Universität München, and he had seen that crowd, and he could see that. And he was, I guess, initially embarrassed by what was happening in his own country, and therefore he sought refuge in Austria. But then, of course, the Anschluss occurred, and the Nazism, his brother, the thuggery followed him, and he was stuck with it again. And that saw him leave Austria after intervening on a number of people's behalf to Italy, to Prague, and then to Bucharest. So he was constantly trying to flee his brother and all what he stood for.
Take us first to Italy, where he entered the film business and he made his first rescue. Tell us that story.
He was actually, he was in the film industry in Vienna. He worked for the Tobias Sascha film industry. And his first intervention was on behalf of Hermann. Hermann was married to an actress, Emmy Goering, and she was approached by Henny Porten. Henny Porten was one of the biggest actresses in Germany at the time, who happened to be married to a Jewish doctor. And Emmy went to Hermann and pleaded that Hermann would help Henny Porten and her husband because she was married to a Jew. She was basically ostracized. She couldn't work for refusing to divorce her Jewish husband. And Hermann called up Albert, who, as I said, was working in the industry at the time, and asked if Albert could help. And Albert said, sure, I'm sure we can arrange a contract for her. And so, he arranged basically a livelihood for Henny Porten.
And that's how it all began. So, William, just to give us some insight into Albert Goering's personality, public humiliation of Jews was a big part of the Nazi program. And in your book, 34, you write about an incident where Albert came upon some old women being forced to scrub the streets. What happened next?
Albert, came across, and you also should remember that Albert was a bon vivant, a very well-dressed man. And so for him, when he came across this mob and SA troops forcing these old ladies to scrub the street, he just leapt through the crowd, took off his coat and put it down, and then went down on his knees and started to scrub the street. were these old ladies, which was unheard of to see this well-dressed man to join these Jewish citizens forced to scrub the street. And of course, the SA troops demanded his papers, and they saw his name, and he basically said that he was the brother of Hermann Goering. And then by that, I guess it showed the power of his name. And then next thing you know, and this is a story that I heard from Jacques Bombasset, the crowd was dispersed. And I guess just for that short moment, those old ladies were given a reprieve. And I guess the thing you remember, you think that, he had a brother, Hermann Goering. He had this sort of golden ticket. He could do anything he wanted because his brother was the second most powerful man. But you have to remember that in a situation like that, during the Anschluss in Vienna, people didn't know who he was.
Sure.
People didn't know he was Hermann Goering's brother.
They could have shot him on the spot.
Shot him on the spot or beaten him to death there on the spot. And that just shows his whole, I guess, psyche and being and what he did for all these people. They're just strangers. He doesn't know them or they weren't friends or anything. He did this as some sort of atavistic kind of need. When he saw injustice, when he saw something wasn't right, he leapt into it without thinking.
But this became an obsession with him. He had the golden name. He had the connection to his brother who, as we learned, protected him from the Gestapo for quite some time, and then began a whole series of rescues, first starting in Italy and then going on. Share a few with us.
Italy, I think what comes to mind is Dr. Kovacs, who was Albert's private physician at the time in Italy, and he basically told Kovacs, who was a Hungarian Jew also, that he has a certain amount of his salary that he doesn't need. Can you please use this money to help refugees to flee Nazi-occupied Europe? In the end, they ended up setting up a Swiss bank account where Dr. Kovacs could only just have to write to the bank and request funds, and these funds ended up in the hands of people smugglers, I guess, which is a very explosive word these days, but, they were heroes back then,
Yeah, smuggling them out, not smuggling them in.
Yeah, people smuggling out. And then once the Italians folded and the Germans took over Italy proper, he gave Kovacs a letter saying that he was his private physician and that all the contents in his apartment belonged to Albert and that he should not be touched. And for that, Kovacs could live throughout the war untouched. And it wasn't just Jews. He also spent time at the Skoda works.
Yes, that was this famous factory in Czechoslovakia where he moved after the Italians threw in with Hitler. He used his position at the Skoda works to save a great many people, but there was a lot of tension on the management team. Give us that picture.
Yeah, it was quite interesting because the owner of the Skoda works was Hermann Goering AG, which was Hermann Goering's empire, basically. But the person who brought Albert in as an export director was Bruno Seletsky, who was a colleague of Albert's in Vienna. And he knew about Albert's political stance, and he knew that Albert would be the perfect buffer in between the Nazi management and the Czech workers. And sure enough, Albert came in and he did everything he could to defend the Czech interests, whether that be freeing the directors from the hands of Reinhard Heydrich, to providing money to the families of imprisoned Czech workers. It was actually the archivist of the Skoda works told me that at the end of the war, Albert left a huge amount of money, half his salary, in the top drawer of his desk, so that Skoda, after the war, could use that money to rebuild into the factory.
There's a famous story you tell in your book where an SS commandant came and stormed into Albert's office demanding to see him. Share that with us. Yeah,
exactly. I got this story from Jorge Sabota, whose father was Albert Goering's secretary. And the SS man stormed past Jorge's father, Karol Sabota, said, no, you got to stop, no. He walks in. And then, according to Karol, he's a huge dressing down of the SS. Albert never saluted any man in uniform at all, let alone an SS. And he did not keep a photograph of Hitler or a painting of Hitler in his office, which was basically standard to do. And if he wasn't Albert Goering, he would be arrested and taken away. And he would just greet them by saying Grüß Gott, which is just an informal greeting in Austria saying, how are you doing? And then so he sent out the SS general and asked Karol, the secretary, come in. So he sits down and he goes, look at this. And he pulls out a family album. And they go through each photo for about 20, 30 minutes. And then finally he closes the book and goes, okay, you can let the kind man.
They're leaving this guy steaming in the outer office.
Yeah, and the joke was that he was the first red Nazi that the factory had ever seen.
And the word got around the factory. I mean, it was a way of Albert letting his people know whose side he was on.
Exactly.
Now, Albert's most daring rescue, almost a great escape, occurred while he was still at the Skoda works close to the end of the war. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, this is a story that I received from Jacques Bassett, who was number 4 on the list, and he was also a close family friend to Albert. I'm waiting for someone to verify the story. But yeah, he told me that Albert took a convoy of trucks to the nearest concentration camp. Mm. And what he did, he confronted the concentration camp and said that he's from Skoda, and he's Albert Goering, of course, and that he needs workers for a work detail. Commandant believed him. I guess it was a work detail, and he had all these credentials, and they filled up the trucks, and this is according to Jacques Bassett. They drove out to the woods and let out all these inmates. Which is, it's an amazing story, and I've yet to verify it from other sources, but, as I say, this has come orally to me.
Right.
But yeah, it's an amazing story, and it is incredible, but then again, Albert, everything about Albert was incredible. So if you knew Albert and the story, you would,
tend to believe it.
Yeah.
Now, the Gestapo was constantly on his trail. Heinrich Himmler was a great rival of Hermann Goering. How did he stay out of the Gestapo's clutches?
There have been a number of arrest warrants that have been issued on his name. Obviously, he was arrested in Vienna during the Anschluss, but his power and his connections freed him. But yeah, looking at all the documents that I came across, and they knew everything what he was doing. They listed all the times that he had intervened, his anti-Nazi behavior, defeatist mentality, everything. He was even listed as public enemy number 1. It all came to a head in the summer of 1944. Albert was in Bucharest at the time, and the Soviets were encircling, and there was an arrest warrant. And he had found out through his connections that he was actually a shoot-on-sight arrest warrant. But this is also coincided with the Soviets encircling, and his passport was frozen, and he was stuck there. He had the SS after him, the Gestapo after him, and of course the Soviets, and that would be the last thing he would want to be in the hands of the Soviets. Probably worse than the Gestapo. But being Albert, he was a suave man, a very convincing man. He convinced some troops to smuggle him onto a train going to Prague in Czechoslovakia. So he reached there, but the trouble hadn't ended there because he had Karl Hermann Frank, who was aware of his actions. But luckily, Hermann found out about this, and he sent his aide-de-camp to Prague in his private plane.
Wow.
And yes, rescued Albert from Prague and flew him back to Berlin to explain what exactly was the mess he was into. And then more allegations aroused from the Gestapo Prague office. This time they were coming from allegations from Albert's secretary, who was actually an
spy.
Spy, an informant. And she collected all his correspondence, and they had a lot of incriminating evidence. There were 4 allegations, including one was an attempted or intended attack on Hermann Goering, which is absolutely bizarre. And it was all solved in a meeting in Hotel Adlon in Berlin on the Unter den Linden, which is a famous luxury hotel. And it was between Hermann's counsel and the SS. And basically, I think the allegation that he was going to attack his own brother, who was his own protection, I guess that was probably one step too far for them. And
they let him go.
Yeah, he would let him go, but not without Hermann demanding Albert to go home to his family and stay out of trouble.
So the relationship between Albert and Hermann remained very complex to the very end. I mean, without Hermann's help and protection, Albert would have been bundled off to a concentration camp. He wouldn't have been able to help all those people. How did that end up playing out?
I guess, they had a very strange relationship. They were both riddled with paradoxes. Like Hermann Goering was said to be the ideal family man. He did everything for his family, and he liked to demonstrate his power in front of his family. But of course, we know him as the public figure, as a war criminal. And Albert, on the other hand, on his family side, he had 4 wives. He was a womanizer, ladies intriguing. A lot of women in his life, the people he supposedly loved, with contempt. But he would go out and save strangers, and they had this strange relationship. But at the end of the day, They loved each other. Inside the Goering family home, they were just brothers. And yeah, you mentioned this Cain and Abel story, and it really, you question yourself, what would you do? I have a brother. My brother's a hairdresser. I'm a writer. We're totally two different things. But at the end of the day, I would always come to the aid of my brother, or would I? It's quite,
Well, Hermann's last words to his brother before he killed himself was something of an apology.
The two brothers met in Augsburg before Nuremberg. It was the last time they saw each other. And he apologized to Albert. I'm sorry for getting you in this mess. Even though Hermann had saved him countless times, without Hermann, Albert would have been long dead. And he asked Albert to look after his wife and daughter. So yeah, they were in the courtyard walking along and having a chat for the last time. And yeah, it's quite an eerie scene, I'd say.
So everyone, of course, knows Oskar Schindler thanks to the Spielberg movie, and perhaps Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat who saved many Jews in Nazi-occupied Hungary. They've been honored as righteous among the nations, an award given out to those who had saved Jews and others. Did they ever get around to giving Albert that same recognition?
Well, I submitted an application back in 2010, and they got back to me finally. I think it took about 2 years, but they got back to me. And they said that the case is still open. Now, they have obviously strict requirements, and in some parts, Albert's story doesn't fit their definition and requirements. But now because I know a bit better now, and I know how the system works, I'm in the process of submitting a second application. And for me, it's weird. It's almost like a reverse murder case. I couldn't prove that he actually saved people rather than that. But I'm using that amount of evidence as I would present in a court. And that's what they need, because at the end of the day, their whole credibility, the Yad Vashem, is dependent on this. So, so I'm hopeful, and the fact that the case is still open, and I feel that they want to believe it, but they just need the evidence there channeled in the way they want. And hopefully, maybe he'll get one of those trees next to Raoul Wallenberg or Oskar Schindler.
Well, William, it's an amazing story of redemption. Thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Great. It was a pleasure.
That was historian William Hastings Burke here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program. If you'd like to help keep our show on the air and expand into more cities, please stop by realclearradio.org and hit the donate button, or contact us for corporate underwriting opportunities. That wraps up our show for this week. Join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.